Hello, everyone. Let's just pull everybody to the chat, and we shall begin. Here we go. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
What's up? How are you?
I am fantastic, thank you. You seem a little bit quiet. Let me see if we can't turn you up a bit. Can you turn your input volume a little bit up on your end?
How is it now?
Oh, that's fantastic. It might actually be
Oh,
it's potentially out booming me, which is fine. Um, and Bunny slash Touch Grass, whoever you are, let's hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello,
I
hello.
can. Can you boost your audio a little bit? Is that possible?
I do not know. Let's see. I will try to my ability. Okay, how about this? Okay, is this working? Is this much more boomier?
It seems okay on my end. We'll see. We'll see when the audience starts complaining about the radical audio disparity. This isn't like the Vosh debate. I'm in a situation where I actually have somebody present who actually has a deeper voice than me, so I'm gonna have to perform this time. Um, hello everyone. I'm very excited to be joined today by Saint Andrewism, as well as, with only slightly less excitement, a friend of the channel, Touch Grass, to discuss James C. Scott's book Against the Grain, a deep history of the earliest states. And yes, I am reading off of a thing because that's how I do. So welcome, Andrew, and Mr. Grass, however we're going to call you in the future. Would you like to introduce yourselves to my audience? Probably unnecessary, but you know, Andrew, please.
sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on President Sunday. My name is St. Andrew. I'm a artist, writer, YouTuber. I cover a lot of different topics on my channel, St. Andrewism, including things like um, anarchism and history and revolutionary struggle. And I'm just really excited to be here because I would say, anthropology hobbyist,
Hmm.
and so works like James C. Scott's Against the Grain and Graeber's whole catalog, and those are the books that really fascinate me and motivate me, honestly, to really consider what our ancestors were like, our similarities and our differences, and I'm looking forward to diving into this book.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm actually grateful for discovering your channel because that's what turned me on to Graeber's work. Categorically, I hadn't even heard of him until then. And I'm reading through right now Dawn of Everything. It's actually quite good. I've got some
Same,
disagreements, but they're
same.
but they're interesting disagreements, and it's rare that that's the case with this kind of material. So I'm actually really I'm really grateful for that. And Mr. Grass, do you want to introduce yourself? Because you're sort of new, not
Well,
totally new, but you're
yes.
sort of new.
Yeah, the channel itself is so new. I don't even think it's been 24 hours yet. But I have been on this channel for quite a while. You've probably seen me in the server. And the channel, though it does not have really anything on it, I'm planning on doing content particularly on radical literature. It's not going to be as heavy in the technical, like I guess hyper philosophy sense, um, but to try to get people to get interested in reading and help people to understand a lot of texts that relate to their struggles. Obviously, things like police, about um, even works like this, like the rise and development of states and of economies and all that jazz. So that is in the making at this point.
Thank you very much. And actually, we owe you
Awesome.
a bit of thanks because you actually organized this, so much appreciated for that. Networking is not my forte, so very, very grateful for you setting this up. All
Yeah,
right, so
also I'm a bit of a fan of St. Andrew's channel, which is why all this happened.
yeah, no, it's stuff's fantastic. I
Brilliant.
was I was really pleasantly. Typically, when people send me stuff to review, it's like it's what if altist garbage. This was actually like really solid. It's very rare that I
Yeah,
endorse
that's
something
the
after I review it.
those videos of yours is what got me into your channel, President Sunday. Because,
Oh,
well,
thank you.
first someone told me that you had covered my video on human history, and then afterwards I saw some of your videos on like what if world hist, and I mean I've been on this. There's a server I'm on, and our kind of like I would say shared frustration is the existence of what if world hist channel. Um, so it's really indicating to see someone pick apart issues with his work.
Yeah, I have no idea how the hell he's managed to get as far as he has. That's mildly terrifying. But thank
Yeah,
you.
the YouTube algorithm pushes him because he shows up in my recommended sometimes.
I, I don't. There must be something else going on. I don't understand it at all. Um, but to get right into it, because we've got a quick hour to fit a lot into. Um, so this talk obviously is precipitated by Andrew releasing a video in October that we've been discussing called "Rethinking Human History," which is excellent, and I strongly recommend everyone give it a watch. In which he made great use of Scott's book, Against the Grain, which I'm holding up despite it being already on the screen, so that makes sense, to challenge received teleological notions of the inherent inevitability and superiority of agrarian states, and this is a line that Scott basically writes, as if human beings were just desperate to escape to under the wings of agriculturally dependent states. Which, as Scott deftly shows, were physically dangerous, brutally exploitative, as well as being particularly vulnerable to systemic collapse, as well as being responsible for the generation of practically all of the most destructive infectious diseases known to humankind. So no doubt we'll dive into all of this fairly shortly. But just to begin with, Andrew, I'd like to begin by asking you, how'd you come across this book in the first place, and like what specifically attracted you to it? See, for me, I had a professor teaching a course on the modern state, and I was a terrible student, and I barely read anything in that class. But he assigned, among other things, the only book I could afford in that class, actually, because it was a bunch of like Foucaultian stuff that was like $80 a text. But this was interesting, even though it had an ugly cover. James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State. And so that's how I became acquainted with James C. Scott, and they had this at the university bookstore, so I picked it up and didn't read it until very recently after I saw your video. I'm very curious as to how you came across it, and what made you pay attention to it and go onto that track. Was this a track you were already on, or was this something that Scott specifically turned you on to?
Right. So for a bit of context, I really got into the sort of considered myself an anarchist for a good couple years, but it's really only in I think early 2020 or late 2019 that I really got into like the heavy theory reading and online networking and discussion and that kind of thing related to anarchism. And so it's through those online discussions and Discord servers and stuff that I was a part of that I was exposed to a lot of the breadth of both anarchist and anarchist adjacent and just general political and historical and anthropological literature. And so in my degree, which I graduated from recently, was in mass communication. So it wasn't my field, but my passion for history, even though I never like formally studied it, is really what drove me to check out books like these. And it really, I think, I can't exactly identify where I first heard about James C. Scott and his work, but it was probably through one of those like Discord discussions that you know got put onto his work, and I'm really happy about that because it's some great stuff.
Hmm. Thank you very much. Uh, Mr. Grass or Touch Grass. I'm not going to call you Touch. Mr. Grass. That's what we'll call you for now.
You can call me TG. Brass.
You are probably the most systematic reader of this, of the two of us at least. So I want to turn it over to you because we've had some discussions leading up to this about the like some criticisms as well as like significant merits of the book, and I think those definitely outweigh the criticisms. And I think the criticisms themselves, again, are more interesting than damning. The book has, to my mind, roughly two halves. So it begins with a critique of sort of this Whiggish teleological, as I indicated in the introduction, view of human history as if we're moving in a linear direction from hunter-gathering to being coalesced into what many people call states. I, of course, take issue with that, where subsistence is predominantly reliant upon grain harvest. And so you have these huge farming
Yes.
communities, yeah, all that stuff. And then we move from there into an alternative history of the emergence of the first states. Now, I don't actually have so much of an issue with that. I'm preempting myself a little bit. I don't have so much of an issue with that at all, simply because the way in which he characterizes the state, at least until the very last part of the book, and even then it's not particularly damning, is loose enough that you can just remove the concept state from it entirely, and it's still a very interesting history. And he fills in some blanks in my own historical reading that have been extraordinarily useful. But just to turn it over to you very quickly to begin with. I think it might have actually been you who introduced me to St. Andrewism's channel, now that I think of it. Do you want to, and I'm sorry to put this on you like right off the bat, do you want to give us like a brief rundown to the best of your ability of the argument of the book?
Okay, that is actually quite a lot.
Yeah, it is.
Basically, the argument, I think, to make it very simple and to go off what you
Because
said,
I came prepared, I'm just
history,
testing you, yeah.
I think the biggest option, yeah, sorry, the biggest explanation, the greatest and like simplest explanation we can have is over the question of, did people choose states? And did people choose like basically what erupted into this monocultural like agriculture, right? Into the development of like, and also like kind of what more or less made this and made the plights of that we still deal with today. And the answer that Whig historians have given is that yes, of course we chose this, and it has given us benefit. And he's saying the opposite. He's saying no, more or less we didn't choose this, and obviously this is quite terrible. That's what I definitely read into it, because when I read these texts that are about early, society, and a great example of this, of course, is the first 5,000, or sorry, Debt the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, um, is how it relates to what we have right now. And he's saying that all of these core issues that we deal with, disease, of course, right now with disease, and war, and of course, right now with the war, at least discussions of that, um, have erupted from this process of sort of the domestication of man, it seems, through grain, and then that leads into the development of states, and kind of why all of those things were necessary developments um, to this process, but not in a positive not in a positive sense, more or less. Yeah, that's what I'd say it's overall getting at.
Yeah, thank you very much. And leaning towards, because this is very much a sequel to, at least in my reading, of Seeing Like a State. I don't know if anybody here's actually read this. It's
It took me a while to get through it, but yeah, I
yeah,
actually
I'm
finished
the
it.
odd one out.
yes.
Not read it.
Scott has a bad tendency, and this is this is probably the only critique of the book that I would say is somewhat damning. Scott has a tendency to go, and so in such and such a place had at their disposal foods like this, and like this, and like this, and like this, and like this. And he will just list it endlessly. You could have probably shortened the
Yeah,
book by a third.
yeah,
Just yeah,
yeah. Like there's a lot you could chop out of seeing like a state and still like completely understand the arguments being made. Like it felt unnecessarily thick in some parts.
yeah, I agree with that. In fact, one of the again, like one of the critiques I have against this book, which is fantastic up until the last third, in my opinion, is that he basically recapitulates Seeing Like a State, but he deploys it where it doesn't really belong. And so while the project is fantastic, and the history that he goes into is actually pretty groundbreaking, it's unfortunate that he deploys it as a polemic against sort of the legibility making modern state, where he's drawing out sort of the emergence of this kind of conniving entity that flattens everything and turns everything into something that it can manipulate, and manipulate to the detriment of ordinary human beings, because of course it's actually quite blind to the real, like, diversity and multifariousness of the reality of the ground. Oh, we're blinking out a little bit here. Is our connection still good? We're green again. Okay, I think we're good. And so in large, like, I mean, the subtitle is gives it away. It's seeing like a state how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed, and of course he's going into things like industrialization, Soviet Russia, and the like.
Specifically, high modernism. Like he
Yeah.
goes into that a lot.
Yeah. And the only issue I have with Against the Grain is that it attempts to transform its project, which is again, as I said, groundbreaking. Like, for example, one of the areas that is just a large blank spot on the map for a lot of people who try to do like a history of the political as a concept, of like the idea of a state identity as apart from simply like an alliance of tribes that happen to hold a lot of material power in a region, is that you have to move to a point where people are identifying themselves with the community such that there arises like a kind of art of what we would call like statecraft or something, of actually like organizing like the laws and the structure of the community so that it's better than worse. And typically they refer just to like this idea of this emergent idea of justice or whatever, this emergent idea of there's a more orderly and better way to organize things and a less, and they treat that as like a cultural, just like a weird cultural quirk that happened here. We know not where it came from. It's just kind of there. Sometimes it's laid at the feet of like Pythagoras and the origins of mathematics and geometry and whatnot. But he does something very, very interesting. He identifies how the sudden need, like he characterizes it as a pistol aimed at our temple, the sudden need by some environmental circumstance to rely upon grains in particular, forced us into a situation where we had to pay attention at a collective level to the management of whole communities along lines of a singular resource. And that actually seems to satisfy that condition of the emergence of one of the central conditions of statehood, which is one thing that he ignores, which is incredibly frustrating because he's so on the mark everywhere else, minus like the endless lists of foodstuffs and whatnot. But prior to that point, his history of just up until he gets to the point where he's characterizing the state itself as an agent and sort of equivocating its agency with the agency of sort of like the modern scientific state or whatever, the state responsible for the scientific forestry projects in Prussia. He talks about at the beginning of this book. It's one of the most incisive things I've seen in a little while. And I had to read it a couple times, at least the first two sections, to come to that conclusion. But it's really good.
The scientific forestry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was
yeah.
That section of it, I think, really was one of the most influential parts, even though it's like pretty close to the beginning of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Just that sort of breakdown of how things went from, the sort of, how do I want to describe it? Sort of domination of nature by man and how that played out specifically in the realm of, environmental consequences. I highlighted some sections of it, so I'm trying to look for that right now, but
Yeah,
I can
please
see
do.
what you're saying.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why that's so poignant is because it's such a clear example of how what's almost become our intuitive way of understanding what we would call intelligence, like at the level of the state, like how the state, I mean, the book is seeing like a state, how the state sees and manipulates its environment. Because post Weber, we conceive of the state primarily as this thing that this territorial thing that somehow bears some kind of rational relationship with its environment that it manipulates. It points out how like its very method of acquiring information, of having to standardize things in order to manipulate its environment at distance, leads it actually to undermine itself. Because by dint of again trying to categorize and being only able to rely upon quantitative evaluations of its holdings, it can't account for sort of like subtler relations between the elements under its control. It identifies trees as like good sources of timber, so it takes account of like the average yields and like how long it takes to grow them and all like the stuff that we would typically think of when we try to imagine ourselves like trying to grow some kind of crop. But it's not a. Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, so he has. I can read the quote directly if you'd like.
Please.
In state fiscal forestry, however, the actual tree with its vast number of possible uses was replaced by an abstract tree representing a volume of lumber or firewood. If the princely conception of the forest was still utilitarian, it was surely a utilitarianism confined to the direct needs of the state. From a naturalist's perspective, nearly everything was missing from the state's narrow frame of reference. Gone was the vast majority of flora, grasses, flowers, lichens, ferns, mosses, shrubs, and vines. Gone, too, were reptiles, birds, amphibians, and innumerable species of insects. Gone were most species of fauna, except those that interested the crown's gamekeepers. From an anthropologist's perspective, nearly everything touching on human interaction with the forest was also missing from the state's tunnel vision. That, in particular, really stands out to me, the state's tunnel vision. The state did pay attention to poaching, which impinged on its claim to revenue in wood or its claim to royal game. Otherwise, it typically ignored the vast, complex, and negotiated social uses of the forest for hunting and gathering, pasturage, fishing, charcoal making, trapping, and collecting food and valuable minerals, as well as the forest's significance for magic, worship, refuge, and so on.
Yeah, so in the process of treating the elements of its environment as simply a resource, as simply like a value to be quantified and extracted and sort of renewed, it's almost more accurate to say not seeing like a state, but how states think they see. Because like as he goes on in that analogy, like they end up ruining the forest because in the process of extraction, which seems like given the values that they've accounted for should be sustainable, they end up killing the forest and damaging the local peoples that relied upon certain things that were not accounted for but were nonetheless removed by their, I guess
Exactly.
by their processing of it. Yeah, so go on.
And I would add that sort of tunnel vision, I think, is honestly reflected in, I guess, state simulator games today. Because I was just, in fact, earlier today I was playing Crusader Kings 3. And that sort of genre of games, not so much Crusader Kings, but the others in the genre, like the Hoi 4 and whatnot, they have this very, obviously for ease of gameplay, but they sort of simulate in a way the way the state sees reality, which is through, numbers and calculations and the very stripped down, legible form of things. And I know we came into the stream to talk about Against the Grain, but I'm also reminded of in seeing like a state, how there's this table where he draws the comparisons between legibility and illegibility of like social groups, institutions, and practices. So like the state would make an illegible settlement that is like temporary encampments and slash and burn of hunter gatherers, nomads, slash and burn cultivators, pioneers, and so on, and make it legible through permanent villages, estates, plantations that they could keep a record of. Unplanned cities and neighborhoods become planned grid cities and neighborhoods. Small property becomes large property. Small peasant farms, artisanal productions, they become large farms and factories. Informal economies that take place off the books must be formalized and brought into the on the books, formality.
Hmm.
Um, Commons, community commons, communal property, they become privatized or they become collectivized by the state. You know, um, Transportation goes from these sort of decentralized webs and networks to these centralized hubs. Even things like people's names. Like local naming customs might be diverse and varied. But what the state does, and I was actually reflecting on this recently because I realized I never really thought about my name and what my name, like my real name, I mean, and what my name meant. And it occurred to me that what I consider to be my quote unquote real name is just the name that, is on my official state documentation. There's like a national system of identification, through birth certificates, passports, ID cards, that sort of thing. And it just sort of makes the population more legible. Whereas, other sort of naming and identification concepts were a lot less standardized and rigid. Like for example, people sometimes went by different names in different seasons, or they might have adopted new identities when they came into new roles. And that sort of fluidity of identity is stripped down and erased by the legibilizing process of the state. And he goes
Yeah,
into stuff like water use and stuff as well, but just that sort of legibilizing, I don't know what the word is, but
I just say
that
legible
sort of
making.
process of, yeah, legible making process. It's one of the concepts that really stood out to me, and it applies to the forestry situation and to those situations as well.
Well, that's the critical link between seeing like a state and against the grain. Sorry, I'm going to let you talk in just a second, Grass, because I know you've been waiting. And
you're all good.
yeah, and I think that's what's most interesting about this, and it's actually my principal contention against the book, because his arguments from the historical material are entirely compelling. My only the only thing that I have some difficulty with is he sort of repeats himself a little bit. So he talks about the legibility making of the state. So the move away from like sort of organic, winding housing neighborhoods where they're sort of conforming to the environment and to like order of arrival and stuff like that. To again like grid type cities where you can identify where things are by like you can actually visualize exactly where they are just by reference to street and address because everything is just at the end of a line. Whereas in Seeing Like a State, he talks about the exact same dynamic in terms of the approach to its domus, sort of the human-made environment from which he conjectures the state emerges. That peoples prior to the state, but especially in the context of the state, start through like burning and partitioning. They make that legible, so they can make use of that in sort of a what some may characterize as like kind of a rationalistic way or some such. And one of the things I run into is in the case of Seeing Like a State, where his concern is primarily modern bureaucratic states already like furnished with bureaucracy and with like a specific sort of methodological status attitude, like in a strategy game, where they're viewing the state as like a territoriality with certain values to be manipulated by a central agency of some kind. It's not clear to me that you've actually gotten to that point here. And so when he says things like legibility making, like I agree there is a legibility making taking place, but I wonder by whom. Like, is it actually intensive in that way? Or intensive, is that the word? Is it intentional? Or is there like an actual like, is there a scheme behind it? And it seems at points like he wants to say that there is. And I think in this case there absolutely is. But I wonder if we can say so like this early. And that's sort of where I have a little bit of issue with the book, because he takes a critical stance to like the Weberian idea of the state as like a territoriality with sovereignty, with a monopoly on legitimate force. So you have like this idea of like the territory of the state itself construed as some kind of agent with decision-making power and rationality. apart from any human being in it. He criticizes that on one level, but he also sort of assumes it to field his critique. He doesn't say that's not actually what happened. He says that that's bad. And I would contend that's not actually what happens at this stage. But it's of course impossible to see, and it's difficult to say that that's not the case either, because like what he describes, it looks like it. Grass, sorry, I rambled on and on. You can speak now.
You're good. What the point I was going to bring up was, and kind of going on to what you guys are talking about, but specifically, remind me because St. Andrew brought up names, is chapter 4 and chapter 5 kind of got me realizing that this process is what he focuses on is that this process is done to people, uh, and specifically in terms of their labor, right? And this is where he gets into the development of slaves and the sort of migrations that occurred. Well, I think he believed that. I think at one point he did say that slavery probably existed before the development of these archaic states, but the mass serfdom and slave societies that we kind of see even to this very day, or hundreds of years ago, obviously developed with the rise of archaic states. But that comes from kind of a simplification, perhaps for the reason of legibility, perhaps not, but a simplification of a person to a simple task, such as, oh, I had it here a second ago, but I think it was in Assyrian culture. Was it? They had a word for basically a serf, which was saknutu or something like that. And what that meant was a captive for the soil. It was a person that you captured, and you put them on like a land and said, "Here, work this land." Um, and how this relates to chapter 4, which is about agroecology, which for everybody else who hasn't read, is he talks about the ecology that sort of developed once this form of agriculture took place, and this is kind of why he's saying that grains make states, which we can probably get into later. um, People were essentialized, just like the lumber was, just like the trees for lumber that we talked about before, for those particular tasks. And he talks about that we're domesticated by this process, but it seems to be that we're also domesticated by each other through like this development of a state process. I don't know if you guys read that
Yeah.
as well in it.
Yeah, that's one of the concepts in Against the Grain that really stood out to me. The whole like ended up like stumbling into it again when I read this book. The Why am I forgetting the name of it? But I read this other book that touched on a similar theme. But the whole idea of humans being domesticated, and he talks about it largely in chapter 2 on the Domus complex. But he also covers it a bit in chapter 1. It just, I guess, goes into how through our settlement into these sort of settings, we ourselves were, from our like bone structure to our nutrition to our awareness of our surroundings, to our relationships with our newly domesticated plants, animals, all these things sort of worked to domesticate us. The domestication process runs two ways, is basically what he was trying to argue.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's in some respects, 'cause I've been on a Rousseau bender for the last couple of months, as everybody is painfully aware by this point. It was a colossal vindication of that, because of course his whole argument is that, and of course like with the whole like colonial chauvinist bent to it, a little bit subtler than his predecessors Hobbes and Locke. But his whole argument was to the effect that we can't project the way human beings relate to each other now into the past as an explanation for why we started to associate with each other as we do. Because how we associate with each other and how we metabolize the world and all this stuff, that also changes our nature as well. That changes what we expect as like a baseline in terms of what we ought to depend on. It changes our assumptions about what like our relationships with other human beings should be. And one of the things that I think we can actually just jump into this right now, Grass, is in Grains Make States. He writes, the key to the nexus between grains and states lies, I believe, in the fact that only the cereal grains can serve as a basis for taxation. I actually disagree with him a little bit here, but I really appreciate this inclusion because it seems to me that he's got the causality slightly backwards, but I think he's very on point here. It seems that the reliance on cereal grains made taxation as such a thing that we could even think to do.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, actually, this is I was gonna one point I would push back that you made.
Please.
So you were getting on Scott's obsession with all the foods, right? All the agricultural products that he discussed. But I think that um, bringing that up enhances this point particularly because you have to understand all of the. And also, because keep in mind, this book isn't exactly the scope is obviously narrow to states and their development, but he's bringing a lot of different kinds of studies here. So we have a lot of different researchers reading this so that they understand um, other fields. Um, but yeah, the reason why he brings that up is because obviously grains are so different, and they're different because well, he brings up all like the different points. And so what was your problem with it? Actually, I really want to hear this.
I actually agree with you. I'm going to take that back a little bit. I do think the lists like could have been abbreviated in cases, but I think generally I agree. Like having gone through it again and having like that hammered into your head, like it really emphasizes the fact that we've moved from having because the main move that he makes, the main argument he makes is that we didn't the move to like an agrarian state wasn't just inevitable. It wasn't the result of simply, oh my god, look, we have this new grain making technology. We're free guys. We don't need to live together anymore. We don't need to like be free anymore. We can live together and work like to the clock in a gigantic corral. Um, like no, we had the technology to do that for a long time, as evidenced by again, like even hunter gatherer tribes making use of the same technology, growing the same plants, manipulating their environment in the same way. Um, Something moved us to rely specifically on one, and that brute forced us into modes of relationships. Uh, he argues that made the state viable, which is not to say it was inevitable. And I think again, like my critique here isn't that I think he's wrong. This isn't like an essential part of the equation. I just think he makes the leap a little bit too early. But I mean, he's still like better than 99% of everybody else I've read in this area. So I think to the extent that there's any weakness in this book, it's primarily just, I mean, perversely because it's a position I have sympathy towards. It's specifically in his anarchist critique of the modern state itself because he's focused on taking that down, but he hasn't noted the transition points between the modern state and the ancient state, and it's the word state deployed for both that's I think causing that conflation. But
Yeah,
otherwise, I think it's completely on point.
I'm a lot more. I actually that's actually what got me kind of into this book in the first place. How I came to it actually was completely Wikipedia Andy. So I do this thing where I just go through Wikipedia and like, oh look, this thinker. Let me read their whole page, and it's like they did a critique on this. Really? And I just boom, boom, boom. You know how it goes. And that's how I found James Scott. I didn't know
For your
anything
male
about James
audience.
Scott. What was that?
Never mind.
Oh,
I
sorry.
just I remember seeing this tweet about like how men do that. They just go on Wikipedia and search through things.
Yeah, that's me. That's more or less me. And um, when I found that point on grains make states, I was like, on Wikipedia, I was like, this is this is amazing. This is actually really interesting. And funny enough, the reason why I thought it was so interesting, um, and I got so interested in reading this, is because of David Graeber. Because in Debt, the first 5,000 years, he actually talks about something similar, with the development of the military coinage complex, which we won't go into too much because this stream is not about Debt, the first 5,000 years. Um, but one thing I will say about that book is the focus is on like why money was even made, and he's kind of making a similar conclusion to like money was more or less made for dominance, and that system allowed for an economy, uh, a large-scale economy where that military could easily move around, basically, because like they can just carry on his coins and like give them to places and be like, "Hey, give me food, sex, and other things." Um, so James C. Scott, he's explained that he's kind of saying the same thing, where it's not just about grains are easy to collect, but also are easy to give out. They can be easily, portioned. And this is where he brings up the portion bowls, for like rationed labor at different public projects that aren't that people aren't feeding themselves, basically. So, for example, irrigation or like let's say the pyramids, like all those people need to be fed in um, in grains and like beer and stuff like that. So that system, um, it's extremely complex, allows for domination on a whole new scale. And that's why I think he makes the point, I think rightly so, that grains do indeed make states. It allows for that, for any of that to occur. And this is where we get into all of this rationalization, making things legible, making things simplified to something particular for the use of the state. We see this exact same thing today, and a common criticism that we see about capitalism, that people are made into, um, commodities, that their labor is set to be used for a certain task. Like all you are is an associate for Walmart. That's all you are right now. That's all your labor is for, is to put the merchandise where it needs to be and to, get yelled at by customers. All you are is to put, pins in the, I don't know, in some thread or whatever, and that's basically it.
It's pinheads on pins.
Pin heads on pins. Yeah, I
That's
don't know
the
anything about pins. I know about being associate at Walmart though. I've never been an associate at Walmart. But either way, yeah.
I have that was too close to home.
Oh
Dude,
wow.
let's keep it later. No, I'm kidding. Come on.
Um yeah, that's more or less the point about grains.
Yeah, yeah. The book should have been called Serial Killers.
Right. So I remember the book that I was thinking about with the human domestication. That was Civilized to Death by Christopher Ryan.
I think I know that one.
Um
That rings a bell.
yeah, the alternate title is The Price of Progress. I think that's the subtitle of it or whatever. But in part 3, um I think is where he goes into it. Let's see if I could find the highlights for that.
The notion of civilization itself, like it seems to be sort of intrinsically following along this track too. It doesn't it? Like it really does seem to be. Um, Because when we think of civilization, like typically what we're talking about is an homogenization of culture outside of some specific political community. Like it's a fuzzy concept. It doesn't really have any particular locus in the world. Like Greek civilization. What the hell are we talking about? There are radical cultural disparities between Athens and Sparta. There are a myriad different linguistic differences between all of the people in that region. What we're talking about
Civilization
primarily.
doesn't matter.
What's that?
But to civilization it doesn't matter.
But at the level of civilization, what we seem to be talking about is an homogenization primarily along precisely the lines that Scott is talking about. Sort
Yeah.
of a move to like, yeah, like a general move to like specific modes of production surrounding like an increasingly narrow set of products or increasingly narrow set of resources. That makes the whole thing legible in to an extent you can characterize them all in a soft way as being of a kind, despite the fact that they may not have any actual concrete connection with each other whatsoever.
I mean, that's one thing that always sticks out to me about the concept of civilization, and it's why I've really sort of grappled with it. Um, because I mean, when you look at the definition of civilization, it's not really something that there's a general consensus on its meaning, at least among anthropologists. And even when you look at how civilization is used as a concept, it is almost always juxtaposed against some savage or barbaric other, right? It's always like applied to some, usually the people apply it to themselves, and they use it as a sort of cudgel against the people they find, like inferior, whether culturally, racially, whatever the case may be. And so when I think of civilization, I can't really see it for what it is without thinking of who is excluded from it.
That's so
I
interesting.
see
I think
the sort of
no, go on, please finish your
negative
thought.
space. Yeah, that's about it. The sort of negative space, the unspoken other that is implied by the concept.
I think you put your finger on something actually pretty insane. Um, Civilization as a concept is intrinsically ideologically specific. Because the entire point that
Yeah,
Scott makes here, like, I mean, it's in the word. Civilizing, it, like, comes from, like, Roman civitas, right? Like, it's referring specifically to a community around an organizational form that is only made possible by a specific monoculture around, like, an increasingly narrow set of resources of a specific type. The very concept civilization itself, it's not even that, like, it's falsely deployed as like a way to say, like, oh, these people are civilized, these people aren't, is it like a better or worse? I mean, obviously that's false, but like you can literally use that term naively and refer to civilized versus not civilized, and you should actually be able to use that in like a neutral sense that doesn't disparage the uncivilized. Why? Because it's literally just referring to, are they corralled and incorporated into a specific organizational form that actually confers tremendous disadvantages and doesn't actually confer in and of itself. Like, obviously they're like, as history has progressed, what we have seen at the very least is that we have acquired certain things, at least given the predominance of this particular technological track. But in and of itself, it doesn't even confer like technological advantages, because we already knew how to do these things prior to that, because of course we had to in order to make that move.
exactly. I mean that's something that Graeber and Wenger bring up in Dawn of Everything. The fact that cities and settlement and agriculture and all these things that we associate with civilization were already being practiced in prehistory. It's not like, the first ever, plant that was ever planted by a human took place, with the first Bronze Age civilization, you know?
Yeah. Charlie Price makes a point that would be useful to correct, actually. I'll let one of you guys jump in. Charlie Price says rice and potatoes can also be easily used as a means of which to control the harvest and distribution towards and lead to the creation of the Chinese and Incan states. I'm going to add, for example, because I think that's what he means, or what they mean. Do one of you want to jump in on and respond to that? Because I already know what the response is, because Scott is pretty specific on this point. Why can't tubers? I mean, rice could, but why can't tubers be the basis of a state?
But
Um,
it's been a minute, but if I remember correctly, I think it's because he had argued that tubers are harder to check in terms of when they're ready. They're less legible than grains in terms of harvesting. I could be wrong. I'm just
yeah, you're
going based
correct.
off my
It's
fuzzy memory.
basically
Yeah.
basically tubers could be hidden and actually could be stored within the ground for before being taken out for quite a while, depending on the tuber. It could be up to like 1 to 2 years even.
And in
And
addition,
also it's
yeah.
it's basically like value per yield is a large one. You can't like potatoes also can be very um qualitatively like different from one another compared to a grain. Like a grain of rice is they're more or less uniform compared to two potatoes.
I actually don't remember
But
that part from
I
the book,
found a
but that's.
quote,
Oh, sorry. Go on, please.
found found a section of the book where he talks about this. Um, right. So the fact that cereal grains grow above ground and ripen at roughly the same time makes the job of any would-be taxman much easier. If the army or the tax officials arrive at the right time, they can cut, thresh, and confiscate the entire harvest in one operation. For a hostile army, cereal grains make a scorched earth policy that much simpler. They can burn the harvest ready grain fields and reduce the cultivators to flight or starvation. Better yet, a tax collector or enemy can simply wait until the crop has been threshed and stored and confiscate the entire contents of the granary. In practice, in the case of the medieval tithe, the cultivator was expected to assemble the unthreshed grain in sheaves in the field, from which the tithe collector would take every 10th sheaf. Compare the situation with, say, that of farmers whose staple crops are tubers, such as potatoes or cassava. Such crops ripen in a year, but may be safely left in the ground for an additional year or two. They can be dug up as needed and the remainder stored where they grow, underground. If any army or tax collectors want your tubers, they will have to dig them up tuber by tuber, as the farmer does, and then they will have a cartload of potatoes, which is far less valuable. I don't know why I'm stumbling on my words so much. It's far less valuable, either calorically or at the market, than a cartload of wheat, and is also more likely to spoil quickly.
That's what I was
Frederick
gonna.
the Great of Prussia, when he ordered his subjects to plant potatoes, understood that, as planters of tubers, they could not be so easily dispersed by opposing armies.
I found that's what I was gonna point out too. Is in addition, like they don't have as much of a store life once they're extracted. Um,
Yeah,
I found
that's a huge one actually. The
I
store
found
life is probably the biggest thing.
Well, yeah, well that would explain like the general move to preferring grains in the first place. That's one of the things he suggests is some kind of catastrophe made the yields of like the multifarious food sources that we used to have less reliable. So we moved to one that we could store for long periods of time and could reliably grow over a long period of time. And there's the additional like factor of trade and whatnot, because once these things become like once we become reliant on sort of like fungible, more fungible, I suppose, resource, and then an economy arrives around that, of course, people are going to intensify the use of that. That last point, though, and I'm glad you actually read that, Andrew. Actually, I haven't asked you. Your channel's called St. Andrewism. Am I calling you correctly? Like, is Andrew the correct thing to call you? I'm so sorry. I'm asking you this now at the end of the stream.
Yeah. Honestly,
It used to be
honestly,
Sandra.
I'm fine with Andrew. I only call myself Saint Andrew because I'm stuck with the name by now. But yeah.
All right. Well, I guess Your Holiness would also be appropriate. But
Sure.
I'm glad you read that last quote, because I found that line fantastically interesting, because that is actually a case almost against his thesis very slightly, where you have like the rational state monarch. What's the word? There's a phrase I completely lost, but like the best example of that. Um, Instructing his subjects to make themselves less legible, by extension to him, as a defensive measure. So deploying like precisely the kind of anarchistic logic that I presume, I haven't read his earlier books on resistance, but presumably deploying that kind of logic in service of the state. I found that very interesting. And it's actually like it's the biggest, like often with a lot of literature like this, like we have sort of an ingrained attitude, har har, to don't laugh at that.
Nice.
I am gonna laugh at that.
We have an attitude towards at least like sort of generally in a cultural sense, whoever the hell I'm talking about, to regard anarchistic philosophy and the like as being in some sense idealistic. sort of like how like Marxist philosophy and whatnot is characterized as idealistic or anthropology or whatever. Despite the fact that, of course, it's like the most well-cited, materially grounded stuff that exists. We'll leave that aside. That's generally the attitude. It has a pedigree in that it was explicitly deployed by a high modern state as a measure that Frederick the Great seemed to know, despite whatever disadvantage it must have accrued to the Prussian state, would make it equally illegible to enemy states, and so could be deployed as effectively a wall in and of itself. I found that really interesting. Like we talk a lot about the concept of nomos on this channel. So like the notion invoked by Carl Schmitt is like the spatial structure of a community, where he talks about like one way you can understand a community is like what are the elements it's broken up into that taken together constitute its whole. What forms like the structure of it such that you can determine when it ends and something else begins, you know, like the thing that a wall does. And I think Scott actually characterizes in a footnote these sort of like zones of legibility as being kind of like walls in and of themselves. Here we go. Yeah. So I'm only looking at the index here, so I can't find the actual page. But he says here the term "quote unquote" wall may be misleading inasmuch as it may well refer to a string of settlements, fortified or unfortified, marking the limit of political control and conceptualized as a state boundary or perimeter. He's actually put his finger on like a really fascinating political ontology that is based entirely around like the limits of legibility in and of itself. That's really interesting.
Think I'm picking up what you're putting down. But
You are very much forgiven if you didn't. That is not
think
that is not your flaw.
I think that sort of something you said just now triggered memory of what you had said earlier, which is the, I guess, sort of light criticism you had about distinction between, earlier states and states today, which is that sort of continuum of legibility was definitely different between, states now and states then. The sense that it's back then, the peripheries and the borders and the, distinctions, and I would say the peripheries and the borders between states or between territories was a lot less blurred and a lot less distinct the further away you got from the heart of the kingdom or the empire or whatever the case may be. Whereas, in states today, there's a sort of totalization of the state's control within its territories. Like there's no fuzziness in terms of borders, and in fact, border disputes are like a hot topic because, like, in those earlier states, there's a. I think he talks about it in Seen Like a State. There's a way modern states have a lot easier time managing the populations within their territories and monitoring them and making them legible. I don't know if that was at all what you were getting into there, but
I was, but I think on a level that I'm not sure Scott himself actually goes into, but he's clearly like on the cusp of it, because he's linking it into like a much more robust critique of the state ontology itself. He's speaking specifically of like the kind of epistemic, I guess, relationship between bureaucratic management structures and the resources over which they're put in charge. But specifically in his characterization of legibility, he offers an alternative account of the actual ontological limits of like state power. So like what is it actually in reality? Because like when we look on a map, we'd see like the lines drawn, showing like the legal holdings of some state or other. Those represent agreements between state powers, but they don't actually represent the actual extensions of the powers of any states, which may go well beyond those lines or maybe well within those lines, depending on what's actually going on. This is one way, at least in the periods that Scott is referring to in particular. This is one way in which you can actually like find a concrete limit. Like literally, where can another state even read the land or the material there such that it can actually exert power or anything of the sort, or at least not in a completely blind way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I understand that. I think, but on this whole point, I wouldn't say that. I don't know exactly if I would put that also against. Well, I guess not really against Scott, but more because I guess what we're getting at here um is that what Scott is speaking of, the seeing like a state, has just developed, right, over time. Because what he's speaking of here is an archaic, like, is basically the very beginning of that sort of state mind, if you will.
Yeah, I think in Against the Grain, the primary issue I have is that he moves to there being a state mind once there is legibility, and he's careful to point out that that's not actually necessarily the case. Like we don't just move immediately to there being like this deliberately legibility making agent in the state, but he still kind of treats it as if there is. So it's like, you kind of let it go. That's the one part where he loses me on. But in terms of like as a condition of it, like certainly as a description of the state, like once you get to like the emergence of a specifically political identity and like Greek states where you have an identification between like decision making powers in the state itself. Because like in Thucydides, I bring up this example all the time, when Thucydides is talking about in his history of the Peloponnesian War, the movements of the different agents in the war, he refers to the Lacedaemonians, Spartans, the Athenians, and he refers to like cities as cities. The cities do a thing. But when he refers to the Persians, he refers to the king because the thing making the decisions and making the actual actions, the thing whose will basically is being projected in the movements of Persian troops is a single individual. And by implication, decision and rational thought and all that stuff, that's being attributed to the community itself because these are like essentially democratic at whatever level of reduction you want to go. These are essentially democratic communities where there's some there's some organ that is associated with the city itself that is making the decisions and exerting its will in the environment. Um, what he describes here is a almost entirely ignored element in the possibility of that emerging. He misses that step, but he also puts this one in that everybody else misses. So I don't think
Yeah,
this is against. Yeah, I don't think this is against Scott at all. I think Scott's actually brilliantly onto something. Um, anyways, Andrew, I know that you had to go at around 7 sharp, so I don't know how much longer you can go for. If you need to go now, that is totally fine. Um,
Yeah, we have a wiggle room of a couple of minutes, but yeah, I do unfortunately have to leave just now.
yeah, no worries. Do you guys maybe want to make some final remarks before we close off, and we can continue this or have another talk anytime you two like if that was enjoyable. This doesn't need to be the last point, so we don't need to worry so much about like the time running out. But if either of you want to like give some final thoughts, remarks, or whatever, and then please shout out your channel, uh, by all means.
Andrew, do you want to say anything?
You could go first if you like.
Yeah, I guess if anything, I think just for a real like review, you know, uh, bussin' or discussin', right? That's like the thing nowadays. Um, I would say if you're at all interested in really states in general and what they sort of mean, which is kind of like the focus of our general politics, even if you don't want a state, like if you're an anarchist or something. Um, I would say absolutely read it. And I think there's a lot to be told, or there's a lot to be had. And one part I would definitely recommend, which I'm not going to read out entirely right now, is the last paragraph, I think, of the chapter "Fragility of the Early State," which where he discusses this little idea that I think is very important to understand, is that the vast majority of human societies are completely ununderstood or not understood, that we don't know basically anything about them, and that more or less the entire world and all of human history is a massive dark age. That's a pretty crazy, idea. So
He's sort of
I'll leave.
the
Yeah.
he's sort of the anti-Jared Diamond.
Yeah,
Um,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in addition to like a lot of human history being legible and unknown to us now, other thing that I think we could wrap up with that Scott points out in chapter 6, is when it comes to the collapse of states, which is usually framed as a negative, usually framed as some sort of violent or destructive upheaval. But he says, what I wish to challenge here is a rarely examined prejudice that sees population aggregation at the apex of state centers as triumphs of civilization on one hand, decentralization into smaller political units on the other as a breakdown or failure of political order. Should, I believe, aim to normalize collapse and see it rather as often inaugurating a periodic and possibly even salutary reformulation of political order. And then he goes into a bit into how ancient states collapse often led to, the scatter of people and really their freedom. I'm reminded of first time I came to terms with the idea of a dark age and what a dark age meant. I I could be misremembering, but I have to remember reading. Seems as though those sorts of periods of state breakdown were ones where people were able to sort of create pockets of autonomy and of freedom, from taxation, from epidemics, from oppression, from death. And so, yeah.
There's a line here from that chapter that I really like. What is read retrospectively as "quote unquote" collapse may often, I speculate, have been triggered by resistance and flight by desperate subjects in the core in situations uh, like this, which I won't elaborate on. But um, it all goes back to, again, like, these were situations that were not entered into primarily because people wanted to or because they were inherently better. These were things that communities sort of fell into out of dire necessity, which enabled exploitation on a massive scale, which was then sort of entrenched in as a specific and almost at this point ubiquitous ideological stance that this is just how things have to be. And one of the great merits of James Scott's book, which is why I'm going to highly recommend it to everybody who hears this, um, is that he challenges that assumption, which is I think what most of the best political theorists have done is they've shown the ways in which all of these things that we sort of take for granted as like the fundamental constituents of what we take to be essentially human society, and all of the things that we take to be fundamentally like conditions of success or failure. Uh, these are we're acculturated into those. They aren't simply aspects of human nature. Human nature has been altered by our history in such a way that that's actually a bad phrase. The human experience has been altered in such a way that we take to be natural things that are in fact highly contingent, and if we're uncritical about them, they seriously limit the range of possible things that we can do, which basically shoehorns us into situations that we really don't want to be in. potentially forever. So, yeah, thank you very much, St. Andrew, for putting me onto this, because this has been tremendously beneficial. And thank you for coming on to talk.
Yeah, it's been an excellent discussion. And, hopefully when I get through this thick book, Dawn of Everything, we'll probably discuss that at some point as well.
I would
In
love to
fact,
do
I would
that.
actually, there's someone I'd like to shout out, who's been sort of making, I guess, a companion to the Dawn of Everything, a critical companion, sort of going chapter by chapter, pointing out some of the issues in the book, but also, confirming and reaffirming some of the things the book gets right. It's by another anarchist anthropologist. Um, his channel is named "What Is Politics." If you type that in, you should get it. Fairly small
I think I
channel.
know that one. I think I know that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He does some good work. So I want to give that one a shout out for people who are also going through Dawn of Everything. And I think it'll be really interesting if we could bring him on as well if we do end up having that discussion.
I would
I think
be
he's
I'd
very
be
informed on this stuff.
I would be very on board for that. So
That'd be awesome.
yeah, that would be awesome. You be there too. You didn't talk enough tonight, so you have to make up for it. And by the way, before we go, Grass, shout your channel out too, with its
Oh, yes.
plethora of content.
Yes, the plethora of content, literally nothing. Touch underscore grass. Check it out. Be there, be square when I start actually making stuff. I think now because of this, I might just do my first stuff on anthropology related stuff, but I'm going to get into a diversity of topics. So, or diversity of texts that go over a diversity of topics. So, yeah.
Cool. And everybody check out
Sounds cool.
Saint Andrewism's channel. I'll put a link in the description once the stream ends. Very, very good stuff, and I don't say that about a lot. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me tonight. You both take care.
Okay, everyone.